Grab your crush gun and fire up your Super NES for one of the best run-and-gun shooters on the system, Konami's Contra 3: The Alien Wars. Released during Konami's heyday, the third console Contra game makes the jump to 16-bit hardware with a whole slew of cool new visual features and design ideas that make for one heck of a game. This 16-bit outing is also the first game in the series to be designed from the ground up for a home console rather than arcades. Contra 3 also remains a console exclusive to this day, but that doesn't mean it wasn't converted to other platforms. They just weren't consoles. You see, Konami commissioned two conversions in the years that followed, one for the original Game Boy and another for Game Boy Advance. On this episode of DF Retro then, we'll explore the ways in which Contra 3 exploits the Super NES hardware, discuss its overall design, compare the original against its ports, and even examine a little Contra history. Ready? Let's get locked and loaded. If you were a Nintendo fan back in the late 80s, you most likely owned at least one Konami game. From Castlevania to Gradius and beyond, Konami and its shell subsidiaries stood alongside the best from Capcom and Nintendo when it came to publishing games for the 8-bit machine. When you saw the red and orange bacon strips in the box, you knew it would be quality, at least most of the time.
The Adventures of Fireberry.
And one of the games which helped make Konami a household name is Contra. First released to arcades in 1987, the original Contra is a brilliant game with a slick, vertical presentation. It was well received, of course, but really, it was the brilliant in-house NES conversion which really helped put the series on the map. After appearing on shelves in 1988, Contra became one of Konami's most popular games for the system. It's a fast-paced run-and-gun shooter with a unique twist, stages which alternate between side-scrolling and pseudo-3D, lending the game additional variety. It's also one of those games that received an enhanced Famicom release thanks to Konami's VRC2 chip. That's the version we've been looking at here thus far. But if we compare it to its Western counterpart, you can see that animation is reduced in the trees in this scene, and it's missing the intermission cutscenes and map sequences entirely. Even with the VRC2 though, the NES version is a far cry visually from the more complex arcade game, with smaller sprites, less detailed background artwork, no parallax scrolling, and simplified 3D sections, but honestly, the expanded levels and NES-style visuals really work well. It's a great conversion within the constraints of the system. The mix of great gameplay, support for 2 players, and a high level of challenge helped make Contra a classic in the hearts of many an NES owner. This was quickly followed up with Super Contra in the arcades, which again received an NES port known as Super C in North America. This time, the 3D stages from the original are replaced with top-down stages instead, which retains the same alternating design. Both the arcade and NES versions offer noticeably enhanced visuals with more detailed background and sprite work throughout. Super C also served as an inspiration for the series' first portable outing on the original Game Boy. Operation C feels like a remixed version of Super C that works well within the constraints of the Game Boy. Sprite and tile size find a nice middle ground, large enough to appear visually attractive but small enough to avoid crowding the screen. And if you're wondering why the main character is a robot in certain sequences, well, we'll explain that later. By this point then, Konami had established itself as one of the dominant publishers on Nintendo platforms with a huge range of popular titles under its belt. So when Nintendo's 16-bit console was unveiled, Konami quickly became one of its most prolific third-party publishers. It started with Gradius 3, their first game for the system. It's an arcade conversion that makes huge changes to the original design, but it suffers from significant slowdown. This was followed up with the more impressive Super Castlevania 4, which works as a sort of retelling of the original Castlevania with new 16-bit visuals and a stellar soundtrack. Both games retain key concepts of the original games while taking advantage of the more advanced video and audio hardware to improve the presentation and increase variety in level design. They were big hits, but perhaps the best was yet to come. Contra 3 The Alien Wars launched first in Japan under the title Contra Spirits before appearing in North America a couple months later. It retained several series staples while introducing new features along the way. Oh, and the existence of 1988's Super Contra is likely responsible for the lack of Super in the title, like so many other games for the system. What sets Contra 3 apart then is the way in which stages play out like a series of set pieces. It's a style of level design that would later define games developed by Treasure, which makes sense as some of the staff responsible for Contra 3 would later help form Treasure. So basically, using a series of bosses and event sequences, each stage in Contra 3 evolves as you play. Case in point, the 4th stage. You start on this bike racing through a tunnel before emerging out into the open desert to do battle with a small tank. This is followed by an assault on the underside of a massive carrier, which eventually sees the player jumping onto the bottom of a helicopter and riding its missiles right into the rear of the massive carrier. It's an impressive stage for sure. The point is, Contra 3 is constantly throwing new ideas at the player and levels rarely stay the same for long. And all of these stages are enhanced by a handful of new gameplay features. Characters can now scale walls and hang on to certain pipes or ceilings, enabling some unique twists in level design. The additional buttons of the Super NES gamepad are fully embraced. Players can hold one of the shoulder buttons to lock position, allowing 360-degree firing, for instance. You can now hold two weapons using a face button to swap between them. You have a dedicated bomb button available in every stage, and you can do this by holding both of the shoulder buttons. Oh yeah. Of course, compared to prior Contra titles, there are still plenty of shared elements and fun callbacks. Case in point, these barricades from the original Contra make an appearance in the first stage. The bombs from Super Contra, the arcade game, which only appear in the overhead stages, are now available across the game. And of course, Contra 3 also features alternating stage perspectives just like the first two games. The original features those pseudo 3D stages, Super C features overhead vertical sections, and now Contra 3 includes full-on, freely rotatable overhead action. At the time, I do recall some complaints aimed at these segments, but honestly, through a modern lens, they play rather well, and you can use the R and L buttons to effectively circle strafe. These stages tie directly into the presentation then and highlight just one of many ways Contra 3 takes advantage of the Super NES hardware. The idea of an overhead rotating map can be seen in older Konami arcade games such as 1988's Checkered Flag. It just so happens that Super NES now offered the capabilities to do this at home. The two overhead stages make use of Mode 7. One of 8 display modes available to developers. Mode 7 specifically enables tile map rotation and scaling. These overhead stages can be built using a maximum 128 by 128 grid composed of 8 pixel tiles. These pixels are then converted into a set of coordinates using affine transformation during the horizontal blank, which is the time between when the end of a scan line is reached and the next one is to be drawn. The system could use these coordinates to perform this operation fast enough to enable smooth 60 frames per second gameplay. The second stage boss is especially unique. Here, this massive boss is displayed using Mode 7, enabling smooth rotation and scaling as he moves around the environment and into the camera. Yet at the same time, players can still rotate the scenery independently. You can't use two Mode 7 layers simultaneously though, so instead the developers appear to use sprites on a stark gray background. You can see the parking lines change as you rotate the camera. It's a neat trick. So how about the side-scrolling stages then? Well, one of the best new features the 16-bit machines offer to developers is support for independent background layers, and seeing as Contra 3 is a very early Super NES game, the technique was still rather new for home players. This enables parallax scrolling and other multi-layer effects, and Contra 3 takes advantage of it in a way that many Super NES games did not. Now at first glance this background seems simple enough, but look at the clouds. As we ascend, it's clear that they move at a variable rate, creating the illusion of depth. Same goes for the background in this stage, which seems to stretch off well into the distance. This visual effect is extremely common on Sega's 16-bit machine, but it's less common on the Super NES, with many games sticking to simple flat backgrounds. In Contra, this line scrolling effect is likely achieved using HDMA, which basically allows developers to make changes to individual scan lines to produce a wide range of cool visual effects. HDMA use is very common on the system, enabling things such as the smooth color gradients that we see in so many Super NES games, and in the case of Contra 3, more complex background scrolling on a single layer. Now, the Super NES has 4 background layers at its disposal, but there are harsh color palette limitations to consider when using them. With Contra 3, the developers at Konami primarily use 3 layers plus sprites. If we break this up, you can see how the foreground is rendered using the first layer, the background uses layer 2, the status bar is on layer 3, and then we have sprites. What's clever here is that the flame effect in this stage is blended with the foreground after the bomb is dropped, and HDMA is used to vary its scrolling speed from the city background. These flames are always present in the background but only become visible after the plane drops the bombs. Stage 4 is even more interesting. It starts here in the tunnel, with background 1 dedicated entirely to the tunnel layer, while layer 2 is scrolling at the same rate. As soon as we leave the tunnel, however, take note of how the developer changes the rate of background update using HDMA on the second layer. Layer 3 then is used for more than the status bar in this stage. It appears to be a static cloud layer at this point, but later in the stage, this layer is used to create the effect of moving clouds. So the developers made full use of 3 background layers to enable smooth transitions between 3 very different scenes, which is how they're able to go from tunnel to desert to sky seamlessly. Sprites then are much larger and more detailed than the NES games. Sprites can be made up of larger chunks and can utilize colors from 8 16-color palettes. The Super NES can display more sprites per line with more colors, which helps avoid flicker while enabling a larger number of on-screen objects, including lots of projectiles. Bosses appear to be created from combinations of tiles and sprites, enabling some massive screen-filling enemies. Contra 3 also makes use of color math to create certain transparent effects, like the bomb blast here, or this cool searchlight, which probably also uses HDMA to achieve the effect. Mosaic is used on the first boss to help ratchet up the intensity, I suppose, and all of this runs reasonably smoothly most of the time at 60 frames per second. Now, there are certainly areas which can slow down significantly, but it's a huge improvement over the very sluggish Gradius 3. Then there's the audio. Using the SPC 700, Contra 3 features a unique soundtrack that evokes a film score more than typical game music, and it does so with a rather thick atmosphere. Just listen to the rather ominous background music in this stage. What's great is that Konami's games all have a unique sound that doesn't appear to rely on the typical sample libraries available to Super NES developers. So it sounds great, it looks great, and it plays like a dream. It's a wonderful shooter with extremely memorable level design that holds up brilliantly today. And for 1992, it was a remarkably impressive effort and just one of many great Konami games which made the Super NES well worth owning. But before we move on to its ports, I wanted to quickly address, well, this. If you grew up in Europe during the 80s and 90s, chances are that you know this series by a different name, Probotector. Featuring a pair of robots as lead characters, Probotector is the result of laws in Germany during this period which pretty much banned the sales of violent games to kids. To avoid issues, Konami simply sidestepped it altogether by replacing Jimbo and Solly in this game with robots. So, up until Contra made the jump to Saturn and PlayStation then, the series was known as Probotector in Europe, and Contra 3, Super Probotector, Alien Rebels. It's a fun little piece of history, and it just so happens that the final game to carry the Probotector name then is our next game. What you're looking at is a Super NES game redesigned and converted to run on a Game Boy. Developed in Cologne, Germany by Factor 5 prior to its relocation to the United States, the Game Boy conversion of the Super NES game is a bit of a miracle. With its huge variety of stages and massive bosses, it's crazy to think that anyone would ever consider converting the game to run on the 8-bit Game Boy, but as you can see, that's very much what this is. It even offers support for things like Super Game Boy with custom color palettes that vary based on screen position and occasional use of the Super NES sound chip. So it's an impressive looking attempt, but how does it really stack up against the original? To find out, let's take a tour through the full game and see how it compares. Right from the start, the entire introduction sequence is recreated using the Game Boy's limited capabilities. The reduction in colors really has an impact on this part of the presentation, but it's neat that they kept this in here, as all of these graphics would use extra memory that eats into their cartridge budget. Once in game then, there are some impressive elements to discuss visible right away. Firstly, on Game Boy, the cloud layer at the top of the screen appears to use interrupts to alter the speed at which it moves, giving the impression of limited parallax scrolling. The layout of the stage itself is very similar as well. Lighter shades are used to represent background elements, which looks a tad strange I feel, but it manages to somewhat retain the feel of this first level. The barriers are there, and even the tank section makes the cut. The first mid-boss, however, is completely absent, which means when playing on Game Boy, players simply run past where the boss would normally emerge. Amusingly, the plane bombing sequence is present and accounted for, and the resulting flames are pretty cool. Without the color math capabilities of the Super NES and limited colors, Factor 5 instead opts to rapidly flash the flame layer on the screen. It flickers on and off with each frame, and on the rather blurry Game Boy screen, the effect is surprisingly convincing and it almost looks transparent. This section as a whole is rather impressive. To save on memory, many Game Boy games typically lack things like slopes, but Factor 5 took the time to implement these elements into their conversion. It's a feature necessary to pull off the level design of Contra 3. Eventually though, we reach the end of the stage where this large turtle boss emerges from the wall, and yes, he is intact on the Game Boy. Well, at least mostly. It should be noted at this point that while the portable version does include bombs, which you can use with Select, the lack of face buttons means that players can only hold one weapon. Either way, stage 1 is complete, and we're off to a pretty good start. The second stage then presents an interesting challenge. Without the scaling and rotation options of the Super NES, Factor 5 opted instead to translate this stage into a standard top-down shooter. Rather than rotating, the player character moves in the direction pressed on the D-pad, and if you hold the jump button while firing, you can also strafe left and right. It looks rather different, but the core concept is there, and even the boss fight for the stage is intact, though without the eye-popping zoom effects. The third stage then, which is perhaps my favorite in the game, once again maintains a level of parallax scrolling with the clouds in addition to slopes. The layout also very closely follows the Super NES original. It feels very faithful overall. This time, however, the first mid-boss is actually present and accounted for, complete with enough sprites around the boss to give the impression of smooth rotation, just like on Super NES. After finishing him off then, the screen begins to scroll vertically, and this guy lands on the wall, forcing you to make your way to the top. On Super NES, he fires 2 missiles with every step, but on Game Boy, he fires just 1, making it easier. Amusingly, the frame rate holds up better during this sequence on the portable system than it does on Super NES. Once he gets into position then, you engage in battle, and things play out rather similarly, though the play area is reduced, making it slightly more challenging. Defeat him then and you can climb all the way to the top, where we find that another mini-boss has been eliminated, this time allowing players to run right past this area into the next zone. Thankfully, this vertical section is pretty much intact on the Game Boy, complete with turrets emerging from the walls and these spinning things. Once you reach the top, however, limitations of the system become evident. This hallway no longer seamlessly transitions to the boss room and instead warps players directly to it. And once inside, the robot brothers you face on Super NES are also missing on the Game Boy, with the portable version cutting straight to Big Fuzz, the boss of Stage 3. Once you deal with him, however, the Game Boy version sends you straight to the next top-down stage. That's right, the impressive ship assault level is completely absent, and I can certainly understand this decision, as it would be a very challenging level to adapt to the scope of the Game Boy. Looking at the second of 2 overhead stages then, we see that it follows the mold of the first example, a fixed perspective with the ability to move and strafe, and honestly I think it looks rather good. Even the boss is intact once again, though of course without rotation. Finally, we arrive at the last stage, which features some major changes. It starts similarly enough, but you wind up facing these guys multiple times on Game Boy rather than just once on Super NES. The reason? The Game Boy version is missing several key boss encounters from this stage, likely due to memory constraints. The Gome Ramos King, for instance, is completely absent on Game Boy, cutting straight to Shadow Beast Kimuko instead, a very creepy looking boss that first appeared in Super C. Sadly, the epic battle with Metal Alien that follows that section is also missing from Game Boy. Instead, you make your way to another one of these guys before facing the final boss. And while it looks quite similar, it lacks the final form. And that's a basic summary of the differences, and hopefully you can appreciate what was attempted here. Factor 5 found ways to work within the memory, sprite, and color limitations of the Game Boy to deliver something that feels remarkably faithful. It's clearly watered down compared to the original, and it is not a replacement, but it holds up better than you'd expect, and it's great to see these types of conversions. The next official port would arrive 10 years after the original release on Nintendo Game Boy Advance. But before we dive into that version, I wanted to mention this. It's a Chinese bootleg version of Contra 3 made for NES. Yep, it's an 8-bit take on the Alien Wars. It's not good by any means, but after sampling it, I was suitably impressed with what has been delivered. This knockoff still requires NES programming chops after all, and those responsible for it did manage to pull off some fancy effects like the scrolling sky here in the third stage. It's unexpectedly impressive. Honestly though, it does not play well at all and feels somewhat unpolished. The level design also takes a hit and feels far more repetitive, and of course, sprites are reused from the original Contra, at least for the main character. Still, it's one of those things you can't help but appreciate from afar. But years later, the GBA port would arrive as Contra Hard Spirits in Japan and Contra Advance, the Alien Wars EX in North America and Europe. Yep, Probotector was no more. By the time Contra 3 reappeared on the GBA, however, the market was rather different with a huge focus on 3D games. Yet the GBA is very well suited to 2D pixel art graphics, and many Super NES games received conversions. So how does it stack up? Well, it's a weird one. On the surface, it looks great, like a near-perfect adaptation of the original Super NES game. The artwork translates over beautifully, most of the effects are replicated properly, and there are even a few new visual tricks, but once you dig deeper, problems start to arise. First, there's the control. There is noticeable latency when jumping, which makes playing the game feel less responsive overall and often more frustrating. With its reduced button count, the GBA port also lacks the bomb, unlike the original Game Boy, and you can no longer hold two weapons, which leads to juggling power-ups at rather inopportune moments. On the flip side, there is at least one new feature. If you hold the L button, you can lock your aim while moving, just like Contra Shattered Soldier on PS2. Then there's the audio, which, quite simply, is terrible. Songs on Super NES which sound like this now sound like this. It's a huge step down all around. Music conversion from Super NES to GBA is not simple, and the system does lack a dedicated sound chip, but these results are more disappointing than usual. As for the rest, well, let's walk through this version again like we did on Game Boy. To start with, the introduction sequence is entirely missing, and interstitial artwork has been changed to more closely resemble the PS2 Contra game. Diving into the first level though, it looks great. The GBA version even sports transparency on explosions, and everything just kind of feels right. The palette has been adjusted, but it's not garish like many other ports. Unfortunately, thanks to the reduction in screen resolution, the playfield has been decreased, and this right here has a significant impact on playability. While it's possible to adapt, as someone that's been playing the Super NES game for decades, I found this one remarkably difficult at times. Enemies and projectiles often appear in places they should not, while your character doesn't always fit in spots where they normally should. This tank sequence is an interesting example. On Super NES, you can drive straight through to the barrier, blast it, then jump out safely. On GBA, it's not possible. You'll wind up dying here. It's a minor thing and not too bad in this first level, but it starts to ramp up later. It's the kind of thing players experienced in the original will notice. On the plus side, the shield also features transparency on GBA, which looks rather cool. Now this mid-boss is another good example. It's just as easy to finish on SNES, but look at the distance between the player and the tank. The reduced playfield is clearly evident here, and it will impact the gameplay in later stages. The next section then is very similar, but again, it's interesting to see how the GBA treats background elements such as fire in this stage. Moving ahead, the part with the leaping fire is especially curious. On GBA, the sprites update at half rate, while they are full 60 FPS on Super NES. When the turtle boss eventually arrives then, I finally understood why the developers opted to use the mosaic effect on Super NES. Without it, the boss looks like a big static object just scrolling onto the scene. It's not great. Once finished though, we move to the next stage and what's this? Yes, the overhead stages are gone, instead replaced with stages from Contra the Hard Corps for Sega Genesis, which just happens to be one of the best games in the series and a showpiece for Sega's machine. So how does it fare here? Not that well. Okay, so visually it looks surprisingly close. The palette has been changed somewhat and background scrolling is updated in a slightly different way, but it's similar. What does not work, however, is the reduction in screen real estate. The unresponsive controls and the Contra 3 mechanics don't really work well here. Hardcore is a faster game, and the level doesn't feel right when adapted like this. It's difficult to jump off the ceiling, for instance, in this very first section, while it's a piece of cake on Genesis. I also feel that eliminating the overhead stages removes a bit of variety from the action, even if these stages are still pretty good. One complaint about the visuals though, explosions. They lack the impact of the Sega version on GBA. Really, despite the reduction in screen real estate, the level does manage to play rather similarly, but every section is impacted by the reduced resolution. It never feels quite right. Keep in mind that Sega Genesis runs this game using that system's 320 by 224 pixel mode, so there's even more pixels missing here on GBA than when compared to the SNES levels, which are limited to 256 by 224. Eventually though, we finish the stage after the excellent fight with the robot, and we're back on the Contra 3 path. And this stage looks great on both systems, but again, things don't always play out as they should. For instance, normally you can run down this ramp gunning down enemies, but not on GBA, and yes, it works without the flamethrower on Super NES. And while we're here, I forgot to mention this. Notice how the sprite has unique frames for slopes? Whether you're standing or running, the sprite changes to reflect his position. It's pretty neat, right? Okay, now let's fast forward to the climbing section here. First things first, the missiles are missing on the GBA version, which actually makes this easier. I assume this is due to the reduction in screen height as there is less room to maneuver. Also, the cloud parallax scrolling appears to be slightly reduced. GBA doesn't quite match the Super NES. Now, the battle that follows is also limited by the reduction in height, requiring a little more time and effort, I found. After defeating him though, we continue, fight this mid-boss here, then make our way to the tower climb. This section looks excellent on GBA, and honestly, I didn't have any trouble scaling it. Once we make it to the top though, these robot brothers, oh boy. Look at the height difference versus the room. The GBA version features a tiny iteration of this boss room, which makes the entire fight less enjoyable. It's basically more difficult to avoid these guys, and also just as difficult to take out Big Fuzz. It doesn't feel balanced for the change in room design. At least once we finish him off, we do get the airship battle stage, which was missing on the original Game Boy, but it still gave me some trouble. Visually, it's very close with excellent scrolling, but the quarters are often so close that it becomes difficult to deal with everything that's thrown at the player. I know I'm repeating myself a lot here, but honestly, it's a critical point when examining this port. Eventually though, I decided I would just use a code in order to grant additional lives and get through this comparison. and thankfully the rest of the stage holds up extremely well. The helicopter sequence looks great, as does the assault on the rear of the airship. Now if we jump over to stage 5 then, we have another hardcore stage. This one also compares rather favorably. There are some changes to screen proportions as always, but overall it's surprisingly faithful visually. Again though, I prefer playing the original iteration over the GBA version of this stage. Let's polish this off then with a look at the final stage then, which also holds up extremely well visually. The same changes apply here, but for most of the stage it works quite well, at least until the near final boss. You see, this part is interesting. Normally on Super NES, it's fairly simple to dodge most attacks and deal with the boss, but due to the lower resolution, certain forms are now nearly impossible to avoid. Just look at this. And that's really my takeaway from this whole project. It's a nice looking port, but it just doesn't play nearly as well. The play space is reduced, the sound is terrible, controls are less responsive, and the hardcore stages kind of feel out of place. It's a weird but curious version of Contra 3 that I'm just not a huge fan of. I'm happy it exists, I suppose, but it could have been better. So there we have it, a close look at Contra 3: The Alien Wars. This is one of those games that I continue to play even decades after its release. It's as beautiful and fun today as it was back in 1992. Is it the best Contra game ever made? Well, that's difficult to say. The hardcore on Genesis is extremely well crafted, and I've always enjoyed Shattered Soldier on PlayStation 2, but there's just something about Contra 3 that I really love. It's a reminder of a time when Konami just couldn't stop releasing amazing games. It was always one hit after another, and most of those games stand the test of time. Contra 3 also gave way to some rather unique conversions that go well beyond expectations. We talk about multi-platform games often these days on Digital Foundry, and for the most part, it's really kind of the same game across multiple platforms with differences like resolution and frame rate. But here, companies like Factor 5 managed to produce small miracles that somehow managed to work out well. The Game Boy has no business running a game like Contra 3, and it doesn't really, but the spirit is alive. But that's it for this episode of DF Retro. Thanks for making it all the way to the end, and if you did enjoy this episode, be sure to let me know over on Twitter. And while you're at it, be sure to check out the DF Retro playlist to catch up on any episodes you may have missed. But until next time, stay retro.